Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Gabriel Collins on 4 scenarios of potential action by the People's Republic of China against Taiwan. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. Today, our guest is Gabriel Collins, who is the Baker Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at Rice University's Baker Institute. Gabe previously was an associate attorney at Baker Hostetler LLP and is the co-founder of the China SignPost analysis portal. He has worked in the Department of Defense as a China analyst and as a private sector global commodities researcher, authoring more than 100 commodity analysis reports, both for private clients and publication. His research portfolio is global. This includes a focus on legal, environmental, and energy issues related to water, including the food-water energy nexus, as well as unconventional oil and gas development and the intersection between global commodity markets and a range of environmental, legal, and national security issues. His analysis draws from a broad swath of geospatial and other data streams and often incorporates insights from sources in Chinese, Russian, and Spanish. Gabe received his BA from Princeton University and a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. He's also a contributor to a recent volume published about the Taiwan Strait issue called The Boiling Moat. Gabe, welcome to our program today. Thanks for being with us.
It's an honor to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So today, you're very compellingly offered us a title on 4 scenarios on PRC's, let's say conflict or coming conflict with Taiwan. Now, we thought we would start by going through them one by one. So why don't we talk about the first scenario, which you call coercion?
Correct. And so we certainly, I guess I'll give a quick disclaimer here that these views are exclusively mine. They don't represent those of the Baker Institute or anyone else that I'm associated with. But with that taken care of, yes, the first scenario is coercion. And this is something that's already ongoing. It's been ongoing for a number of years, and it's intensified significantly over the past several years. What we mean by coercion are various steps short of outright kinetic war that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, has been taking to shrink Taiwan's operational sovereignty in cognitive spaces. And this can take the form, a few examples here. One is these regular flights that we now see by the PLA, where aircraft fly into the area southwest of Taiwan, where there's an air defense identification zone. More recently, we've seen more aircraft approach and in some cases cross the median line in the Taiwan Strait, which is a very important symbolic demarcating line. And we've also notably started to see long-range PLA drones beginning to circumnavigate Taiwan. And in some cases also, we see air exercises and activity to the east of the island, which has a distinct signaling function, basically says, okay, Taiwan, your allies that might come to your assistance if there were ever a higher level contingency, we can actually interdict that path. Also, in terms of coercive activity, we've started to see a much more sustained presence in the last couple of years by the PLA Navy, which now regularly has ships operating in the vicinity of the island. And then we've also seen other irregular activities. For instance, we see periodically where undersea cables are damaged, and I guess I'd put some quotation marks around damaged in terms of whether or not this is accidental or intentional, by ships near some of Taiwan's outlying islands. And we've seen drone activity from time to time near some of the Taiwanese islands that are right near the PRC. And then finally, we've actually recently seen a Taiwanese fishing boat detained by the Chinese Coast Guard. And so you see this steady ramp up of activity that, again, is designed to shrink Taiwan's space for maneuver.
Let's talk about the second, which in some ways is related to the first, which is what you term blockade.
Correct. So coercion and blockade, this is a really interesting intersection between the two, because once somebody like the PRC is engaged in this intensive level of coercive activity, the things they would need to do to step up to a point where you start to get into quarantine or blockade territory are actually not enormous, because what you're ultimately trying to do with a quarantine or a blockade, depending on the intensity of it, is at a minimum, and maybe this is more applicable to the quarantine scenario, you want to show that Taiwan doesn't actually have real sovereignty over its nearby maritime environment. And when you're stepping up to something more akin to a full blockade, you're actually trying to force capitulation without fighting. Basically, we're talking about an island that is absolutely dependent on air and maritime linkages to the rest of the world. Over 80% of the island's primary energy supply comes from fossil fuels, all of which are imported. The semiconductors that it's so critical for producing, those rely on inputs that are constantly being brought in by ship and aircraft from abroad. And they also rely on the ability to access external markets, again, through either airborne or maritime commerce. And so if these start to be interfered with, it's hugely consequential. And to give a sense of, kind of the sensitivity here is if we think about August of 2022, in the immediate wake of then House Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, there were missile firings or other live fire exercises by the PLA in various zones that they had denoted around the island of Taiwan. And there were real impacts on maritime traffic. Liquefied natural gas tankers delayed offshore and didn't come into the port of Kaohsiung on schedule. And there were other maritime and air traffic interruptions as well. And, I think this was certainly part of the PLA's intent in doing what they did, is, again, to demonstrate the level of vulnerability to this type of activity.
That they could do, and you believe they could do it? They could successfully pull off a blockade for an indeterminate period of time?
That's a bigger question, and that there's a few factors that would hinge upon. One is the capacity and the willingness of Taiwanese forces to take action against a blockade, which would be an existential threat to the island's de facto sovereign status and its ability to continue its way of life as they know it. And then the other huge variable is whether or not the United States and its allies would intervene. And this is one where the discussion gets really interesting, because our general policy has been one of strategic ambiguity, but at the same time, President Biden now, I believe 4 times, has said that the U.S. actually would be willing to defend Taiwan. Now, what I think is maybe less clear is if there were an invasion, which is the next scenario that I think we'll probably talk about here, that one, your trigger points for intervention, I think, are much more clear. One of the things that makes a blockade a tough option is the PRC would be putting the United States and other potential intervening parties in a position where they would effectively have to contemplate throwing the first kinetic punch, and that's something that politically is very complex and difficult. So it's a pretty it's actually a pretty nasty option in a lot of ways, and it's something that, to the extent that we can do things to deter it, is very much in our interest and frankly the world's interest to do so.
Right, but it's also I think, as you're suggesting, there are some risks for the PRC to do that. I mean, besides the step you're talking here, which is a big one, but in actually maintaining a blockade against that type of attempts to run it would be a big step on their part.
Exactly. And when we think about various options for dealing with this, there are, I think, a fair number of non-kinetic or at least non-military options where there's an implicit threat of the use of military force, but we're not actually using it. And we're sort of turning that escalation dilemma on its head and putting the burden on the PRC instead of ourselves. And what one example I would give, and this is one you'll see me speak more and write more publicly about in coming months, is thinking about the idea of increasing U.S. flagged vessel traffic into Taiwan, particularly for vessels that are carrying food supplies, energy supplies, and things like that, because that's something right there. It's one thing for the PLA or perhaps the China Coast Guard, depending on how they structured their blockade or quarantine, to use rigorous enforcement measures against vessels that are flagged in Panama or Liberia or some sort of flag of convenience state. It's an entirely different proposition if you have vessels flying the American flag. And so this is just one of many options. And then there's passive options as well, thinking about ways, for instance, to boost energy storage capacity on Taiwan, for instance, underground oil storage facilities and things like that, where they're inherently more secure than what exists now, and where they also buy more time and space for Taiwan and its allies and partners to respond. Because I think the most dangerous aspect of a blockade scenario is if we're in a position where, for instance, right now you have 2 weeks of natural gas inventory storage capacity on Taiwan. If you start interfering with inbound shipments, which in turn interferes with the electricity supply on the island, you're talking about a very compressed timetable there, puts enormous pressure, and it eliminates a lot of options. If you can start extending that out significantly, that accrues to the benefit of Taiwan and its partners and complicates the PLA's task and objectives.
Right. So we have a better reaction time.
Correct. Exactly. You get time and space to think and structure responses rather than being forced to work on this timetable that's really set by Beijing.
It's an interesting scenario. What would you say are some indicators and warnings we might see if the PRC was really contemplating this move?
Exactly. So for a blockade, this is one that's tougher on the INW challenge spectrum, because one of the things that the Chinese are effectively accomplishing with the increased tempo of PLA air and naval operations near the island is they're basically setting themselves up where you could fairly readily step from what are effectively presence and intimidation operations into something that goes beyond that. Because whether it's presence and intimidation or whether it's actually something designed to interdict maritime or even potentially air traffic, the thing that's an absolutely necessary prerequisite to that is the presence of your platforms in the area so that you can actually physically enforce those barriers that you want to put up against transit in and out of the island. And so this is something where, when we're thinking on a timetable of preparation and when you might see things starting to unfold before the event actually fully manifests, this is one where you're talking hours or days. It's very short timetables. I guess maybe one area where you might see some variability is you would ask, how intensively do they intend to do this operation? If it's something where they really wanted to immediately go for fully sealing off maritime transit routes, you might actually see larger than normal ship movements. And so that's maybe one INW indicator to watch. And you would have to watch both the China Coast Guard and the actual PLA military vessels. But one where I guess the converse of that, where it'd be more challenging, is if they start and it becomes kind of a creeping exercise. I think that one you have far less warning than you would if it was something where they just went for the whole deal, seal off right away.
Right. Well, that's an interesting scenario. That gives us a good segue, though, into the one that we spend most of the time, it seems to me, talking about, which is invasion. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. So in invasion is probably the core nightmare scenario. What I guess maybe ameliorates the nightmare aspect a little bit is invasion is inherently much harder to do. You've got to cross 100 miles of water here. And if we just think in history, think about the challenges that Nazi Germany faced wanting to attack Britain. There's a reason that Operation Sea Lion never happened, and that was half the maritime distance that the PLA would face, moving large, heavy forces, which are ultimately what would be needed to actually occupy the island successfully, is no small feat. I mean, if you look at U.S. planning in World War II, we seriously contemplated an invasion of Taiwan to kick the Japanese out, and we called this Operation Causeway. And we ended up choosing a different path, I think, in part because of just the sheer scale and difficulty. Now, that's not that particular decision on our part is not something that helps me sleep better at night, because we had a different intent and a different set of objectives than China does. For China, Taiwan is the objective. For us, defeating Japan was the objective, and an invasion of Taiwan was one of multiple potential pathways to get us there. So I think the danger level in this case is much higher. In terms of how we look at the invasion issue, and I'll speak briefly to sort of what it means strategically, and then I'll speak subsequently to potential INW indicators that we would look for. In terms of the strategic meaning and in terms of how this informs our preparation, you know, when I was being trained as a lawyer, we learned about this idea of lesser included crimes. And basically, for those of you on the call who were smarter than me and you're in an intelligence course instead of at law school, what lesser included mean is if you have somebody on trial for capital murder, what you've done to be accused of that act and put on trial also likely exposes you to lesser charges. There could be first-degree murder, there could be second-degree murder, there could even be manslaughter further down, because what you did for that big action effectively encompasses everything else. Invasion is similar here in the sense that if we can take the steps to deter invasion, we have a better chance at deterring things lower down the coercion ladder, because basically when you think about what the objective of a blockade is, if we step down that ladder of intensity from invasion to blockade, the blockade is not so the PLA can go drive around ships and fly aircraft. The whole point is to get Taiwan to accept coercive annexation by the PRC and become part of the PRC and be, rejoined, which is an abiding Communist Party objective. Invasion is basically a much more violent, extreme way of trying to achieve that same end. And so if you're able to deter the most extreme, what it starts to communicate to the PRC potential is, look, if there's enough firepower on the island to defeat an invasion force and all that comes with that, there's a pretty good chance they could actually take the teeth out of a blockade as well. So, important there in terms of how we think of this strategically. In terms of INW indicators, a full invasion would give significantly more warning. I think we don't want to overstate this. The Chinese have likely learned from watching how the Russians built up before they invaded Ukraine or reinvaded Ukraine in 2022. And they saw what the consequences were when months and months of lead indication were delivered, and the US was able to work to rally a coalition that then kicked in quite effectively to help Ukraine defend itself once the invasion began. I think they would want to mask much more effectively than the Russians did. But you would see significant movements and buildups, when you're talking about heavy ground units, to the extent that we can track the PLA rocket force, because I think one of the other lessons that the PRC has probably taken from the Ukraine war is that the Russians went in light because they thought it would be easy. If the PLA is learning from this, we'd probably expect to see them fight more like the way we do, where we bring a huge and heavy firepower hammer. We bring it early in the fight, and we really try in the first week to achieve a high degree of knockout against our adversary. And so we'd see the preparations that would facilitate that, whether it's the missile force, to the extent that we can monitor activities at airfields. In terms of the world I come from, which is an energy and commodities world, we would be looking for fuel buildups, particularly of refined products, jet fuel, gasoline, diesel, anything that you need to run a ship, to run an airplane, to run a tank, and so forth, within maybe a 500-kilometer or so radius. And then obviously the maritime lift itself. These won't all be military ships. Some of my former colleagues at the U.S. Naval War College have recently done phenomenal work looking at how China has applied military standards to building its civilian roll-on, roll-off, and vehicle carrying ship fleet. Those, I think, are assets that, if there were ever an invasion of Taiwan, would come into play. So you'll watch all these things, but just given the sheer mass of the operation required, you would get lead warning indicators that, even if not necessarily a flashing neon sign, would be a lot easier to spot than, for instance, what might be the case with a blockade.
I mean, we'd be looking at D-Day times whatever number you want to assign to that. I mean, it would be would be a gigantic operation over longer.
It would be huge. I mean, just to kind of put the tonnage and logistics of warfare into perspective, is, I watch fairly closely what U.S. Transportation Command reports moving into Ukraine. And I think at this point, the last update I saw from a few weeks ago is like 712 million pounds of supplies. And so you convert that into tons, we're on the order of 250, 300,000 tons of supplies. This is something that would be much, much bigger than that. I mean, we're basically supplying just part of a war effort. There's a whole bunch more coming from Ukraine and coming from other places. If this is an operation the Chinese are running themselves, knowing the kind of kinetic intensity they would have to bring to go after this well-defended and soon to be probably better defended mountainous island that they have to cross 100 miles of water, we'd be talking millions and millions of tons of mass that have to be deployed. And that's something, if you know what you're looking for, you can pick up things that, even if they don't automatically throw up a red flag of invasion, you would definitely detect anomalies that we could then use to cue deeper looks, at some of the specific risk vectors.
I'll have a question for you later on that, because there's something, if we can get to it later, I'd like to ask you about, in terms of just that, right? The mountainous, island of Taiwan, but not all of it's mountains. So let's talk about our fourth scenario now, which is destruction. And this is kind of this is sort of the doomsday scenario, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, this one is the one that I really, it's really awful to contemplate, especially, anyone on the call who's ever been to Taiwan. It's a fabulous place. I mean, I've spent much more time in the PRC, over the years than I have in Taiwan, but they've really built something marvelous there. And so when you think about this scenario, it's horrific. But I think in the wake of what has happened in Ukraine, it's one that we have to consider nonetheless. And the reason I bring up the destruction idea, I think it's exceedingly unlikely that the PRC would ever start an operation this way. Basically, for those of you who are familiar with PRC writings and thought on the Taiwan issue, there's often talk of a joint firepower campaign. And that's basically using their long range rocket force, maybe also air delivered munitions and ship fired munitions in various ways to bombard key targets on the island. That is something that's really part and parcel, or maybe a prequel to an invasion. Destruction is something different. What got me thinking about the destruction scenario is watching how Russian behavior shifted when the short, sharp takeover of Ukraine that they intended bogged down and then failed. How did their thinking and how did their actions on the ground evolve after that? And I think, to put it very bluntly, what we've seen, if you look at how they've approached Mariupol, just absolutely bombed to the ground. If you look at almost every smaller city that's anywhere near the front lines in eastern Ukraine and Luhansk or Donetsk or some of these areas, just a horrific destruction. But even things that are beyond tube artillery and rocket artillery range, if you just look at the level of munitions expenditure against Ukraine, I keep a data series, and I'll post updates on LinkedIn later this week for anyone who's interested in the chart. But I track what I call heavy strike munition use. It's basically anything that I can find in public sources that the Russians have fired at Ukraine that's bigger than a 300 millimeter multiple launch rocket. And the bottom line is, the last time I updated that, I was at about 12,500 munitions. These are cruise missiles, Iskander ballistic missiles, whatever they've gotten from the North Koreans and Iranians, Shahed drones, and so on and so forth. It's probably closer to 13,000 now. And the reason I bring these numbers up is really for two reasons. One is the Russian economy is smaller than that of the state of Texas. It's basically a tenth of what the Chinese have. And even adjusting for that economic size, the Chinese industrial base is just so much more technologically capable than the Russian one. We think about the missiles that the Russians fire. If they can produce 10 or 15 new missiles each month of any variety, that's actually a pretty big win for them. We'd probably be looking, in the Chinese case, of refire rates that could be hundreds of missiles per month, or maybe even more, depending if you look at everything cumulatively. And so the reason I say all this is, if you think about a scenario where an invasion is attempted and then it fails, what then happens when you have a party leadership who we've seen over and over from a whole multitude of decisions is concerned about personal political survival among all else? Do they just accept this defeat, or they potentially take a route kind of like the one Vladimir Putin chose when his invasion of Ukraine bogged down? And basically boils down to, okay, we're not going to be able to quickly conquer this the way we thought, so we're going to stay in the war, we're going to just destroy it, and we're going to keep trying to grind forward. I still think this is a much less likely scenario with Taiwan, but it's something that we have to at least contemplate in terms of our thought and planning.
And like you suggested at the beginning, it could be very well part of number three, invasion, and something would pretty much assure that there'd be part of this destruction scenario included in that.
Absolutely. There's actually, if anyone here loves, sort of war fiction by well-informed folks, so there's a book that Mick Ryan, who's a retired Australian brigadier general, published last year called White Sun War. And actually, in White Sun War, Mike, the sort of sub scenario you're talking about of major destruction being a subset of invasion, I think that's absolutely right. It's actually one that he spends quite a bit of time engaging in the book, which is a great read. And it's something that we've seen in practice over and over. I mean, think about after we came ashore in Normandy, it wasn't like we just rolled to Berlin. We had to literally fight our way every inch of the way there. And you think of the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, the same type of thing. If it's a scenario where you have defensible terrain and you have somebody who doesn't want to get invaded, who has a certain proportion of the population that is armed and motivated, and you still have military forces who are capable of fighting, that may have survived the initial assault and so forth. This is something where, even in the scenario most favorable to China, you could have months and months and months of warfare. And to your point earlier about the geography of Taiwan, the east, there's a very narrow coastal plain, and then there's a huge central mountain chain. The tallest peaks are over 10,000 feet tall. The western part of the island, which is where most people live, is a flat plain, but it's also enormously built up. I mean, basically, you have almost 24 million people, but it's the total island's the size of Delaware. In the area where most of the people live is maybe a third of that. So it's very dense and built up.
Right. You could just take over parts of that and probably would be a mission kill, if you will. Just like you wouldn't need to get the whole island. You might be enough to coerce a surrender.
Maybe that's the really interesting one, because the scenario, I think, when you look over and over at PLA, Chinese statements and some of the training the PLA does and some of the capabilities they're building, it certainly points to something kind of like what you saw the Russians try early in the war against Ukraine, where you have this lightning airborne assault on Hostomel Airport, which they wanted to seize to get an airhead to bring in a lot more forces and try to take Kyiv as quickly as they could to achieve political decapitation. I have a suspicion that we would see the PRC try something kind of like that, only in a much more intensive way, because I think, again, when you think about lessons that Chinese strategists and policymakers might be learning from looking at the Ukraine war, is look at how transformative it was when that political decapitation effort failed. And 48 hours into the war, you have this iconic image of President Zelensky walking through the streets with his guard and inner circle of policymakers saying, look, we're still here. We're going to stay. We're going to fight. And here we are almost 900 days later, and Russia's grinding away, but it hasn't even come close to achieving its objectives. I think the PLA sees that. And I think the question that Xi Jinping and his inner circle have to ask themselves is, if after years and years, after decades of preparation, the expenditure of probably cumulatively well over $1 trillion on building military capability, if we go try to achieve this nationalist objective of taking Taiwan and then we fail, what are the consequences for us out of that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack there, but thanks for answering that. I couldn't resist. That was the question I had. Okay, so
it's completely
let me get to our audience questions now. Thanks for everybody for being so patient, and just please put your questions in the Q&A or chat. Okay, so here's one. You recall CSIS's war game on the Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan. And our question says it was played 24 times and showed that 3,000 plus troops were killed in 3 weeks fighting. Would the consequences of losing Taiwan be so devastating to the US that these deaths can be accepted? How would you convince the ordinary American people that the US needs to intervene militarily to prevent a Chinese takeover of Taiwan by whatever means necessary? Okay, so in other words, we're familiar with that war game. And it was expensive, but expensive in ships, 7 fleet ships, very expensive. Correct. What do you think of that as first of all, as a potential for what we might see? Do you think it was realistic? And to the bigger question about the cost, what do you consider?
Certainly. So the way I'm going to start my answer to that question is to present 2 possible worlds that we as Americans could inhabit in the wake of a successful coercive annexation of Taiwan by the PRC. So, one world in which you have a destructive invasion is a world where the world's most critical high-end semiconductor capacity has been destroyed and will take multiple years to rebuild. And for a good chunk of the legacy node chips that are still important, the same kinds of semiconductors that made it hard to get appliances and cars and other things during the pandemic, big chunk of those are produced in China now. And so you're in a world where we're now deprived of some of the things that enable, AI, that enable all these technological things that we're becoming increasingly used to and take for granted. You've removed all that, and you have the compounding losses of prosperity and human well-being that come from that. And then the remaining portion of semiconductors, a big amount of that is coming from the People's Republic of China. And you can bet your bottom dollar that they would politically condition those supplies. And so do you want to live in a world where instead of seeing a US president fly to certain oil producing countries to ask for a few 100,000 barrels a day of production increase, you instead have the US basically having to consider subjugating major national interests in order to obtain, things that we need to make basic aspects of life run. And so that's one version. The other version is one where the PRC is able to accomplish this with a little bit less destruction, perhaps through a blockade that succeeds in forcing political capitulation. And it's not just a world where it's a land of the blind and China's the one-eyed man who's king because it has legacy semiconductor production. It's a world where you still have that legacy semiconductor production base. You have increasing capacity within the PRC for more advanced chips, and you have the PRC now effectively in charge of the world's most advanced semiconductor fabrication plants. And the reason I present this scenario is think about if we go a little bit further over in the world and we look at the Middle East and we think about the Carter Doctrine and US policy there, where we were basically openly willing to use military force to preserve access to about 20% of global oil supply that flows out of the Strait of Hormuz and out of the Gulf region there. When we're looking at advanced semiconductors, Taiwan accounts for about 90% of global production. So you think of OPEC and OPEC plus, this is multiple times more important to the world economy. And out of everybody, the United States is by far and away the most proportionally exposed. If you look at where those semiconductors from Taiwan actually go and who is able to put those to the highest value uses, it's often US companies.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about logistics. One of our viewers has a question on how the Chinese capacity is to even sustain a blockade or an invasion for a considerable length of time. What do you think about its capacity there, and how effective might we be at reducing its ability to sustain that?
Certainly. So in terms of the specific capacity, I would have to go take a deeper look at some of the ports and other facilities that they might use, to sustain these sorts of operations. I think in terms of sustaining a blockade, that's a lift that's significant, but it's lighter. I think where your sustainment challenge goes up there is if people start actually trying to run the blockade or push back against it. How do you enforce that? Because you just think about kind of the maritime periphery. There's a couple of ways this could potentially play out. Basically, if you want to reduce your exposure to shore-fired anti-ship weapons coming from Taiwan, that means you're operating much further offshore, which effectively dramatically expands the maritime space that you have to have awareness over and that you have to be able to generate enforcement capacity in. If you want to shrink that space, what your trade-off is if you decide to park your ships 5 or 10 miles, for instance, off of a main Taiwanese port, is you dramatically reduced your enforcement space in the area that you have to maintain domain awareness over, but you just dramatically concentrated the target set for anyone in Taiwan that has a capable shore-launched anti-ship missile. My suspicion is, given Russia's experience in the Black Sea, and given that Taiwan has far more advanced anti-ship missiles than the Ukrainians do, PRC would probably opt to operate further offshore, and so it's going to be a heavier lift. Now, the really heavy lift of an invasion is and this is a great question. We have a lot of options if Taiwan is able to stay in the fight beyond the first few days, because that pipeline of ships that's having to bring goods over and bring wounded back and move things back and forth across the strait is an enormously inviting target for our long range strike capabilities. It's something that preserving that umbilical cord is something the PLA would have to devote a lot of assets and attention to. And that would potentially open up other options if we choose to intervene that help us, contain the Chinese lodgement on the island, and hopefully, even though it would take a lot of really prolonged and hard fighting, get them off of there and, again, preserve, sort of go back to the status quo that so far has brought us 80 years of peace and prosperity.
Right. Let me offer another question from one of our viewers, talking about what the impact of the economy in a war like this. Getting to, you mentioned the blockade, the invasion. I mean, these are big steps, obviously. What would you see as the impact, even to the global economy, if something like this were to happen, in disrupting, just to start, one of the major shipping lanes in the world?
Exactly. Now, let me just ask a clarifying question. So is this question presuming blockade, or is it presuming something that's higher on the kinetic scale?
It was asked in terms of the invasion. So if that were,
Okay.
if that were the case.
Yeah, invasion would be phenomenally disruptive. I mean, you're speaking with someone here whose formative days at a hedge fund basically occurred in the run up to the global financial crisis in 2008. That was a pretty interesting and scary experience. This is something that, depending on how it plays out, could probably literally be an order of magnitude worse than that. I mean, I think we could realistically be talking about the biggest global economic shock since World War II. I mean, we've looked at 120 years of global GDP data, and the only thing that we find in terms of, kind of downside that might start to approximate what a war over Taiwan would yield, again, is World War II. And, the only difference is the global GDP number was goosed a little bit, well, is goosed a lot in a positive direction, because while the rest of the world cratered, the US spooled up an industrial base that basically half of which had been idle because of the Great Depression. And so you see this 8% year on year downdraft in the worst year of World War II. But you have to remember that that was offset by this phenomenal American industrial spool up, that we don't have 50% of our industrial base idle now. And so probably it's something where the overall global economic impacts could actually even be meaningfully worse than what we saw in World War II.
I mean, we'd have to but disruption to the Chinese economy, disruption to the South Korean and Japanese economy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm talking about globally with these numbers, but
directly impacted with their essential supply.
Yeah, it would be significantly worse than COVID. I mean, I guess maybe to give people a more recent anchoring event that we've actually all lived through is, you think about the economic dislocations that were caused by pandemic lockdowns and, the things the coronavirus did to our societies. This would be multiple times worse than that, and it would happen fast.
Okay, another question for you. Something I think that is right up your alley. ENT Sources for following the INW issues that we were raising earlier. You're the founder of a website on this. Are there other things that you like looking at that might give some of our viewers who are interested better idea of what to look for?
Yes, it's funny you asked a guy who, loves looking at Google Earth imagery of coastal China to see what new things he can find in the latest round. Yeah. So, in terms of my, regular work here, we've spent an awful lot of time looking at energy centric indicators. And so I'll give a few of those and then I'll step out more speculatively about things that, especially for some of you who may be coming from the military or government intel world or thinking about going back into it might consider looking at. So on the energy side, crude oil inventories we follow very closely. The associated ship traffic is something you'd look at closely, maybe with a slight, also refined product storage. These are sort of on kind of the 3 month, maybe the 1 to 6 month scale. On the 6 to 12 month scale, you're looking at in beyond, you're looking at construction of underground oil storage facilities. You're, looking at various things that are happening in the Chinese coal industry because that's their baseload source of energy in their economy, and so forth. I think in terms of some of the things you'd look for as invasion signals that maybe go beyond macroeconomic preparation, which is really what you're doing with your energy sector, and are, more specific to the actual act of invasion. One of the things that I haven't done, but I would be really interested in doing, and I think this is something you can do on the OSINT level with, the types of imagery and other intelligence that are available now, is build a model that looks back, seeing what vessel traffic patterns look like along the Chinese coast. If I were doing this, like if somebody gave me the grant money tomorrow, I would probably use synthetic aperture radar data to the extent that I could get it, because a lot of the time there it's smoggy, it's foggy, it's cloudy, and visual imagery probably doesn't get you where you need to go. And also, you don't need to see a single ship. What you're really looking for here is kind of how mass balance moves in the Chinese coastal maritime economy. I would try to build something that went back as far as we were able to go with the data to get a sense of what the pattern of life looks like. And then I would really watch moving forward for anything that materially changes that, particularly in the vicinity of Taiwan, but also further up and down the Chinese coast, because the maritime mass that you would need to actually conduct an invasion is likely significant enough that it's not just going to visibly and observably influence things in the near environs of Taiwan. It'll probably do it in major maritime hubs further up and down the Chinese coast as well. So I think if I were to pick a single thing that I would look at, that would probably be it. I think sort of the adjunct to that is if you can get all of that synthetic aperture radar data, is build a ground traffic model for the onshore areas and compare the two against each other. And I think that would, especially if you started layering on some of the open source signals intelligence and other things we could get now, you could build a model that's not perfect but would be pretty strong, and it would be using data sources that are not contingent on things the PRC itself discloses, because it's just sequentially closing off avenues of data, and so you want something that's really insulated from that.
Very good, thanks. And thank you, everyone, for the excellent questions. We have 10 more minutes, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. One question, U.S. CHIPS Act. Do you think it is sufficient to shrink or close our vulnerability regarding advanced semiconductors? Or how long
I love that.
take?
I love that question, because you're going to get the shortest core answer of any I've given so far. No. And I'll explain why. So the CHIPS Act, we've authorized the deployment of $52 billion. If you look at TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, it's basically the global Saudi Aramco of semiconductors, but like times 4 or 5 in terms of its proportional importance. Their capital investment over the last 20 years has been over 200 billion and US dollars. And basically this amount, the buy-in just keeps going up over time, because if we were looking, 10 or 15 years ago, a semiconductor fab was a phenomenally expensive and complex undertaking, but it was something that was $1 or $2 billion. If you're looking at the late generation plants, anything that's fabricating at 3 nanometers or smaller, you're looking at something that's more like $20 billion for a single facility. And the technology frontier is constantly advancing and getting pushed ahead. And so I think the CHIPS Act is a great start, but I think we have to be very realistic with ourselves that it's not anything close to solution. It's a starting buy-in that gets you on the field. And then at least if we want to do advanced chips. So I am going to expand, I guess, a little bit in the response. And this is something the US should think about. We want to be able to fabricate more of the advanced chips domestically, but we also need bigger legacy chip production. I would argue if we're going to do anything like a second CHIPS Act, you actually get a huge amount of bang for your buck in terms of just capacity need if you invest also in lower end fabrication facilities for all of the chips they're more mundane from a techie perspective, but they're critical for, again, for cars, for machinery, for all these things that are so integral to our lives. I think investing on both ends of that would do more for our security than investing all the money in chasing TSMC, which is still far, far ahead of us.
Right, great. We have time for a few more questions. Let's take one that appeared earlier. How prepared do you believe Taiwan's defense forces are for some of the scenarios that you've mentioned? We touched on this, but maybe a little more in depth on what you think what's been going on with them and how well their preparations are.
That's a really hard question to answer, because we can see some of the hardware purchases, and I think we see positive signs there where there's still some degree of affinity for big ticket buys. You think of F-16s, you think of the program to produce a advanced conventional submarine domestically and things like that. But I think we are starting to see more emphasis on drones, on mobile and survivable anti-ship missiles, whether procured from the US or domestically produced, interest in artillery, whether that's 155 millimeter tubes or the HIMARS rockets that we've seen perform so well in Ukraine, things of that nature. We're starting to see some hardware shifts that are really important. The two things that I think are a little bit, one is easier to assess visually. The other, I think, is really hard, because it's more about what's inside of people's heads and hearts than it is about what we see parked in an equipment yard. The easier to assess thing is, what are physical steps that are being taken to basically harden infrastructure, to put obstacles and mines and things like that in place on potential landing beaches and so forth. Those kinds of preparations, I think we need to see intensify significantly and rapidly. But I think that third category, what's in the heart and what's in the mind, that one, the really honest answer is I don't know. I mean, sort of speaking to you as someone who in a past life played contact sports, you don't really know in a football game how somebody's going to react until that opening kickoff and the first hit. And somebody can assess more easily for a society like the US or Russia, because we get in wars fairly frequently. With Taiwan, and maybe it's a good thing, it speaks well to them, but we just don't have that body of historical evidence to use. And so I think that's an area where there needs to be huge focus, and it's critically important, but I don't know.
Right. Well, that's fair. Nobody knows but that's something that, and I think there are some gaps, even on terms of their other capabilities that we just, that I understand we just don't have a really.
The attitude, I guess the one tangible indicator is when you see some of the public discussion on attitudes toward mandatory military service. I would sleep much better at night if Taiwan could evolve into something that's more like Israel or Finland or Estonia, where compulsory national service and the time you spent in the military, and I think Israel's maybe the lead case of this, is something that actually gives you real social capital. People are proud of their service, and society is really proud of you for serving, and you're encouraged to do so. And you're encouraged to do so not just in a perfunctory way, but where it's fully intense and 200% bought in. If we could import some of that culture onto the island, everyone benefits from it.
Okay, what couple more, and one, I think I'll just summarize this quickly. What lessons learned do you think the Beijing has from the war in Ukraine? One on U.S. resolve, and the other on just say defensive capabilities.
Absolutely. So I think in terms of probably the simpler and clearer lessons, and I'll preface this by saying this answer is speculative because the Chinese are not talking much publicly about what they're truly and deeply learning. I think one is bring a really heavy firepower, bring it firepower hammer, bring it early and bring it hard to try to break your adversary. A second thing that they're likely learning is that if you're going to go for political decapitation, you've got to do it much more intensively and effectively than the Russians did in Ukraine. And don't assume that your preparatory intelligence and infiltration efforts actually succeeded in winning hearts and minds, because the Russians failed badly on that account in Ukraine. And I suspect the Chinese have learned from that. I think another lesson they've taken away is that you definitely need to gird for a long war. You know, you think of these stories of Russians being basically going into Ukraine with hardly any rations with them and having to go loot stores just so they could eat. I would suspect that logistically, this is a mistake the PLA would not make. In terms of U.S. resolve, that's a really interesting and complex question, because Ukraine is very important for us, but when you think of the importance that Taiwan has for the global economy, again, I think it's something where you think of our level of attention and interest to the Middle East and you multiply that, and that's probably an appropriate lens. Also, the level of commitment that we've professed to Taiwan and that we've undertaken via action. Basically, before the Russians went in February of 2022, our relationship had tightened significantly with the Ukrainians since 2014, but it wasn't nearly as deep or as long-standing as the relationship we have with Taiwan, which basically goes, back, essentially to 1949, 1950 timeframe, and has been fairly intense since then. And then finally, we never had a U.S. president make 4 public statements that we would defend Ukraine if it were attacked, and that we would actually be willing to use our own military to do so. So I think it's really difficult to compare the two, just given the sheer level of interest, the implications for U.S. alliances and partnerships, and also the level of commitment that the U.S. has made. And then finally, a dimension that is really important to consider is if you think about PLA doctrine and the importance that we see them express repeatedly about the need to essentially preempt a U.S. response by striking at American forces in the region. If you introduce that dynamic as well, that's also a game changer, because that's not something we had to deal with in Ukraine. Imagine what a Ukraine response would have looked like if the Russians did a massive long-range precision strike on U.S. bases across Europe, and how we would respond to that. And that's a scenario in the Pacific, given what the PLA says it would like to do and given the capabilities they've built, that we have to very realistically consider.
Couple of quick ones for the end here. I think there's a segue from that to this question, which is, they must see, wouldn't you think that that they would be exposed to some type of sanctions that the Russians would, and how would their economy be able to handle that? China being such an important trading state, how would they manage to handle that if there was such a an event as a war with Taiwan?
Exactly. So they've certainly been taking steps. I think they've watched the Russian experience and they've watched what we've done with Iran and Venezuela and North Korea and other smaller countries that are part of kind of this global axis of revisionism. They're definitely working to try to harden themselves against the effects of sanctions. But I think at the end of the day, when you're as big and as globally tied in as Chinese economic actors are, there's limits to how much you can harden yourself. You can't do what North Korea or Iran do, where you just basically go to this autarkic mindset. You see strains of it in what Xi Jinping says and what he wants to see done in terms of policy in China, but there's inherent limits. But what I think the corollary of that is again, we can go after somebody like Iran with very tight sanctions because their size of their whole economy is like a medium to large US metropolitan area. It's not globally consequential. Russia is basically smaller than the economy of the state of Texas, I think by a pretty significant margin now. And so you can target them when you're talking somebody who in economic terms is a near peer. How do you target them without inflicting grievous economic harm upon yourself? I think my own view is that there's real limiting factors there because I'm not sure that we're ready to accept the damage that goes with that. And if you want, concrete evidence that maybe it's not apples to apples, it's sort of, apples to oranges or bananas. They're not the same, but they're both fruit. Look how reticent we've been in terms of economic warfare that actually goes after Russia's oil sector.
Yeah.
Which is meaningful here. We're worried about gasoline prices going up and the political impacts and all that. Well, those types of impacts pale in terms of what would happen if there were significant economic warfare between the US and the PRC. So my view is we would be very likely to significantly pull our punches. And I think if we're thinking that sanctions would be a deterrent in this case, one of the lessons we should take away from the Ukraine experience is that when a leader is ready to roll the iron dice, you don't stop them with sanctions. They have to be stopped or deterred through the very credible threat of military force that you have to lead with hard power. If you're leading with sanctions, your deterrence is likely to fail.
Very good. That's a great way, I think, to end this. Jim, sorry I didn't get to your question, but it's simply too depressing to contemplate. We'll need another hour for that one. But thank you for asking it. Thank you, Gabe Collins, for being with us. Thanks for a great presentation, being so generous with your time. And thanks for everybody for joining us today to talk about 4 scenarios on Taiwan.
Thank you for having me. These are into the audience. These were phenomenal questions. Yeah. And an event without a good audience is just 2 guys talking to each other. So we appreciate y'all.
We appreciate it. And join us in a few weeks on July 28th for Inside Intelligence. It'll be at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, which will be on risk-taking analysis with a senior analyst, Harry Yaidi. So that's on the 28th of July. Hope to see you then. By the way, a link for that is in the chat. So again, this is Michael Ard for Inside Intelligence. Thank you, Gabe Collins, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.